Good evening and welcome to this seminar sponsored and organised by the North Asia Centre of Asia-Pacific Excellence. I am Paul Clark from the University of Auckland. I'm Director of the North Asia CAPE. The North Asia CAPE is charged with helping build New Zealand's understandings of China, Korea and Japan, of strengthening New Zealanders' abilities to engage productively with that region of the world that is so important to us. Part of the efforts that people are making in that space, in terms of exporting to Chinese, Japanese and Korean consumers, for example, involves e-commerce. And tonight, welcome to an evening of paranoia. What can go wrong in that e-commerce space? Our speaker tonight is Dr. Joe Burton from the University of Waikato. He's based in the Political Studies Department at Waikato, which is one of our North Asia CAPE consortium partners, but he is also based at the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science. There must be lots of stories to be told at the university. Joe received his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Otago. He's been the recipient of fellowships at NATO in Europe and in the United States and in Taiwan. He brings a wealth of experience about the dangers of that virtual world and will share those with us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the North Asia CAPE for putting on this event, and it's really great for someone from Waikato to come up to Auckland and have an opportunity to interact with you. And you've done some great work through the CAPE already, and you've been very visible, and it's really great to see a number of Centre of Excellences established in New Zealand looking at this array of issues. So it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I want to try and do basically 5 things in the talk this evening. The first of which is to outline what I think is the growing global impact of cyber insecurity, as I call it. I want to spend some time categorizing and defining cyber threats, because I think quite a lot of the time actually we see quite a lot of conflation when we talk about cyber security, about the different types of activity, cyber crime, cyber espionage, cyber warfare. So I want to try and help us all hopefully clarify collectively what we're focusing on. I'd like to examine some of the latest trends and challenges in cyber security, talk about New Zealand's exposure to this area of activity, and about some of the things that we've been doing as a country to respond to cyber threats, and look at what some of the things finally in the lecture that we might do as we move forward into the future. And I talked with Anne in organising the talk today about the World Economic Forum report on global risks, basically the global risks landscape. I think it's an annual report that they produce, looking at the wide array of security challenges that we face. And it's interesting to see in the 2018 report cyber featuring quite prominently. So on the left you can see the World Economic Forum classify cyber attacks as the in the top 3 risks in terms of likelihood, and top 10 risks in terms of impact. Cyber attacks rank 6th. And this aligns to some extent with how our own government in New Zealand classify and categorise these issues. Under the previous bill, English government, cyber attacks were classified as one of the 6 top security issues that New Zealand is facing. But there's a lot of scepticism I encounter about cyber attacks and cyber insecurity still. I'm sure we've all been watching pictures on the news the last few days from Indonesia and the earthquake and the tsunami. These, of course, are catastrophic events which have a really marked impact on people. devastating impact on people. And cyber risks and cyber attacks just aren't tangible in that same way. There's also, if you talk to sort of security professionals or security studies or terrorism scholars, really the things that they worry more about are things like improvised explosive devices, small arms, acts of terrorism wreaking human impact, and the likelihood still that cyber attacks ever cross into that threshold and actually cause direct violence or a loss of life is still very rare. It's hard to identify a single cyber attack in history which has actually directly led to the loss of life. So there is this level of skepticism about cybersecurity, but I think it's a less tangible threat, and I think in various ways it is having a global impact, and we do need to, as with the World Economic Forum and our own government, take these issues seriously. So what evidence is there of the impact of cyber attacks and cyber insecurity globally? Well, one issue that I'm sure we're all familiar with is the impact of cybersecurity in the recent US election, the 2016 US election. And I don't propose this evening to get too political and talk about Trump and Hillary Clinton too much, but really as an independent observer to this process, cybersecurity I think really featured very prominently in that election campaign. We had the ongoing scandal, for example, over Hillary Clinton's self-confessed misuse of an email server, sending classified information from a private email server, and James Comey's announcement of the reopening of the investigation into that use of that email server just 10 days before the election took place, I think really hurt Hillary Clinton's poll numbers in the immediate run-up to the election. That's not to suggest that a cyber attack or the use of a non-classified email server was responsible for why she lost, but certainly it had an impact in that closing stages on how her campaign was perceived. If we also look at some of the evidence that's come out of the US intelligence community, I think we can see cyber having a really big impact. The text on here is very small, and I don't intend it to have you read sort of lots of paragraphs of text, but the Office for the Director of National Intelligence report on Russian activities and intentions in the election said that Moscow's influence campaign followed a Russian messaging strategy that blends covert intelligence operations such as cyber activity with overt efforts by Russian government agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls. So this was really, according to the US intelligence community, a campaign, a sophisticated directed campaign of cyber subversion, the hacking of John Podesta's email accounts, the release of information through WikiLeaks, manipulation of social media, the putting on social media of propaganda that was very critical of Hillary Clinton. Again, arguably this had a big impact and a hitherto unseen impact on the US democratic process and the election process. Again, I'm not suggesting Donald Trump is president because of Russian cyber attacks, but clearly cybersecurity is featured incredibly prominently in the electoral process of the world's leading power. And for this reason alone, I think we have to take this issue seriously. And is evidence of the global impact of cyber insecurity and what can happen when people don't take cyber security as seriously as they should. Extreme weather events and earthquakes are often quite localized, but cyber, of course, can really have a global impact. We're living now in an era where we've got really a globally interconnected system of computers and computer networks. This is the very essence of globalization, if you like. One example of this global impact was last year with the WannaCry ransomware. Have you guys all heard of WannaCry? Familiar with that? Got quite a lot of media coverage. Didn't affect New Zealand all that much, but again, this is one of the biggest, most impactful cyber attacks that we've seen to date. It affected the WannaCry ransomware, which is pictured here. This is the screenshot you would get if your computer was affected by WannaCry. It's quite an appropriate name, isn't it? I think I'd want to cry if my computer shut down like this. It affected over 230,000 computers, some estimates at 300,000 computers, basically shut down by this ransomware. It combined malware with Eternal Blue, which was a leaked NSA hacking tool. So it alludes to a situation where the intelligence agencies and community are storing exploits for potential use. Those exploits are then hacked and released and modified and engineered for use by nefarious actors. So it hints at the geopolitics, again, involved in cyber insecurity. If you actually look at how many victims they were, and particularly the amount that paid ransom demands, it's again quite a small number. 338 victims actually paid the ransom that was demanded in Bitcoin as a result of this ransomware. And the hackers are only thought to have raised about $140,000 in total revenue. Pretty small figures, but then you look at, again, the global damages related to WannaCry. According to some estimates, losses amounting to $4 billion due to the loss of computer hardware, the need to recreate computer networks and respond, and the damage that it did to key industries, and particularly the healthcare system in the UK. One of the reasons why it was so widespread, and this alludes to another reason why we have global impact, is because lots of the exploit was basically based or targeted Windows XP operating systems. Does anyone here still use Windows XP on their computers? I was at the hotel across the road trying to print my notes, and they still had Windows XP on the computer at the hotel across the road, which I found quite surprising. But it just illustrates. Again, we live in a developed country. Most of us, thankfully, can afford to have the latest operating system on our computers, Windows 10. But there are lots of legacy software systems out there which Microsoft or Apple, whoever, no longer provide security patches and updates to. So again, this alludes to the potential global impact of people still using legacy systems, legacy software, and the vulnerabilities that are created as a result. Again, a huge global impact. In case I'm not fully persuading you, there are some other statistics which, again, certainly feed into the paranoia that Paul mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And this is a problem which does cause a lot of fear and insecurity. And I think some again of these statistics demonstrate that. And I'll just run you through these. The global cost of cybercrime, according to Microsoft's estimates, is around $600 billion a year. Cybercrime is now bigger than the global drugs trade. So I think that's quite an astonishing turnaround. Now, the statistics do vary. It's quite difficult to quantify the overall global damages which result from malicious cyber activity, but generally we see statistics ranging from about, at the moment, $600 billion to $2 trillion. Cybercrime is estimated that it will cost the world $6 trillion annually by 2021, almost a doubling from 2015. And according to Cybersecurity Ventures, this represents the greatest transfer of economic wealth in human history. Globally in 2016, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, cybercrime was the second most reported economic crime. In just one quarter in 2016, we had 18 million new malware samples recorded. So the software, the malicious software that's being used in these attacks is evolving quite rapidly, new variants being produced every day. And each one of those requires us to patch our systems, to patch our computers, to provide the security updates that can stop those computers being vulnerable to those malware. So the internet security providers are constantly having to adapt to new and ever more sophisticated malicious software. Other estimates, 2.1 trillion, the total global annual cost of all data breaches by 2019. In 2017, 1.5 trillion, the total revenue cyber criminals coaxed out of their victims worldwide. And if we look at impacts particularly on the business sector, a 2017 study of 254 companies across 7 countries put the annual cost of responding to cyber attacks at 11.7 million per company, which is a year-on-year increase of 27%. And cyber breaches recorded by businesses have almost doubled in 5 years, from about 68 per business in 2012 to 130 per business in 2017. So again, these statistics vary. I'm not a statistician. There are varying accounts of the overall scope of this activity, but by all accounts, this is a pretty worrying trend. A greater volume of malware, greater volume of malicious activity, and this is of course growing with global access to the internet. We still have only around half of the world's population having regular access to the internet. As data penetration grows in countries, we would expect these figures to keep growing. The chart on the right indicates, as you can see, that computer misuse and fraud, including digital fraud, has now overtaken things like violence and sexual offences, theft and robbery as the main criminal incidents in the UK in 2015. So really we're seeing quite a big overall change in the pattern of crime and the sorts of crimes that are being committed at volume. To give you an idea of the sorts of sectors that are facing impacts from cyber insecurity, again, most surveys and statistics, and these are figures from Statista.com, emphasise that probably the sectors which are facing most of the impact are things like energy, healthcare, retail and wholesale, manufacturing, infrastructure and financial institutions, all in the top 6. And we often talk in cybersecurity about the term critical infrastructure providers and attacks increasing against critical infrastructure providers. If we have attacks against energy plants, against water treatment facilities, against hospitals, these are likely again to have a significant human impact. We've seen again examples in Ukraine in the last few years of Russia hacking the Ukrainian power grid. We've seen regular reports about hackers targeting nuclear facilities, nuclear power stations, nuclear energy plants, reports which are probably a little bit of hyperbole about the vulnerability of things like the UK Trident nuclear submarine program. Probably some of those are overstated, but again, quite regular attacks targeted at the nuclear industry. And of course, financial institutions as well. These institutions are of course targeted because of the likelihood of generating revenue. A particularly famous example in the last few years, again, the hacking of a Bangladeshi bank, which led to a loss of around $81 million. Again, thought to be linked with North Korean hackers. So we have a situation where at least it appears that the North Korean regime is supporting state-sponsored hackers to raise revenue for the regime in light of the sanctions that we see continuing against North Korea. So again, if we're looking at where the targets of the attacks are, we ought to be worried given the critical nature of some of these sectors. Am I persuading you? I'm not. It's a remarkably sunny day, right, to be talking about such grim things. This is the perils of being a lecturer in international security. I'm talking about cyber terrorism or nuclear Armageddon, and when it's a sunny day outside, there appears to be a disconnect there. But anyway, this is my life. What about, again, to be a bit more specific about how businesses are being impacted and targeting? This interesting survey from Telstra looks at the type of losses, the type of risks that businesses in both Asia and Australia face. And again, I apologise that this text on here might not be too clear for you. But the top business impacts of cybersecurity incidents include revenue loss. So if your website is shut down for the day, you obviously can't. If you're selling stuff on that website, you can't do business. That is a revenue loss. You might lose customers as a result of cyber breaches. Psychological stress to workers. This is where the paranoia comes in, fearful about cyber breaches and what individual people are doing. Productivity loss that's related to that. Corrupted business data is another really concerning area. We often talk in cybersecurity about the CIA, and I don't mean the intelligence agency, I mean the principles of confidentiality, integrity, and access. And this is what we want to guarantee with our data. We want to make sure it's confidential. We want to ensure the integrity of our data so that it's not manipulated or corrupted. We want to ensure that we can access that data. So the integrity is a big problem. If data is interfered with, people can lose trust in their business models as a result. Loss of jobs for key executives if they're held responsible for these kinds of activities. Distrust from consumers and or partners. Reputational loss. This is a huge factor, I think, for businesses if they're subjected to a major cyber intrusion. They lose their clients' data, for example. This affects the reputation of the country. The company. An example of that was the the Sony hack in 2014, where this was the hack that was in retaliation, if you like, allegedly again by North Korea for the production of the film The Interview. I don't know whether any of you have seen that film, which really caricatured and mocked the North Korean leader, and there were retaliatory cyber attacks directed against Sony Pictures as a result of the release of that film, which led to, again, a big loss of data, confidential records of Sony employees and so on and so forth. And that had a reputational cost on Sony Pictures in the United States, such that their stock price dipped considerably in the aftermath of that attack. It recovered eventually, reasonably quickly, but again, this is to do with reputational costs, how those companies are perceived. Lawsuits, massive fines to be paid to authorities if you're deemed to be negligent, and of course loss of intellectual property. If information is stolen from your business, which is proprietary, developed and released by companies overseas, that is a projected revenue loss from losing your intellectual property. And particularly in the military strategic area, which is what I spend a lot of my time studying, this is a massive issue. In 2007, to give you an illustrative example, about just over a decade ago, the United States Department of Defense lost about 24 terabytes of data from its computer systems. So that's 24,000 gigabytes of data in 1 year of information lost by the US Department of Defense for hacking, and that included things like proprietary technology, which were then used by other actors to develop their own military technologies. So again, it features very much in terms of this geopolitical competition that we're seeing in increasing amounts within the international system. So these are the areas which I think perhaps are most important to think about when we think about impact on the global business community. So again, my point here in outlining these things is that yes, there's a degree of skepticism around. Cyber attacks are less tangible than explosions or earthquakes or extreme weather events. But I think you can see that this area is having a very significant global impact, and this is why it's becoming a priority for so many countries and of course for the business sector as well. I'd like to spend a little bit of time going through some sort of definitions and trying to categorize cyber threats for you. And I appreciate that some of this might be a bit simplistic. There's probably some hardcore cybersecurity people in the room here, and I don't want to talk down to you. But I do think it's important to be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about the nature of cyber threats, because there's often a degree of conflation here. I've spent a lot of time studying NATO, for example. The former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, described cyber attacks directed against NATO as a permanent form of low-level cyber warfare. Well, actually, what I think he's referring to really is cyber espionage. It's extracting information, trying to monitor NATO networks for espionage purposes, for communication purposes. So even our statesmen, our leaders of big international organisations tend to conflate these areas of activities. So probably the most pervasive, and it's worth just being quite simple about what we mean by cybersecurity as well, and I think this is probably the most simple and elegant definition that I found. Essentially, we're talking about measures taken to protect a computer or computer system against unauthorised access or attack. These are the four areas that I think are perhaps of most concern and that we ought to have some, I think, analytical clarity about. Probably the biggest, most pervasive area of activity is cybercrime. Here we're talking about things like money laundering, online data theft, computer-related fraud, phishing scams, credit card fraud, hacking of bank accounts, so on and so forth. How many of you experience this kind of activity yourselves? Yeah, efforts to get into your computer systems, direct you to dodgy bank sites. It's quite a common form of activity. And again, I think it's one of the most pervasive. To give you an idea of the sorts of volumes of activity across different areas, again, the text is pretty small, but the areas in green here relate to computer-related fraud and forgery. So that's one of the biggest area of activities. The area in red down the bottom relate to computer-related production, distribution or possession of child pornography and computer-related solicitation or grooming of children. Up the top, illegal data interference or data exchange or illegal access to a computer system. So these are the main areas of cybercrime activity across Europe, Asia and Oceania, the Americas and Africa. And again, I've had my colleague at Waikato University, Ryan Coe, cited some research in a talk that he did recently about some research that monitored what was happening on the dark web and the deep web. And a lot of the activity there, perhaps the highest volume of activity in that area, again, is the distribution of child pornography. So a hugely damaging area. And I think it's quite useful to think about the sorts of offences that we're talking about here, and again the pervasiveness of this type of activity and the human impact that it can generate. So cyber crime again is a huge problem area, and unfortunately there's still some really big issues around jurisdiction, policing, evidence gathering, prosecutions of cybercrime. I heard a presentation from the chief of the cybercrime division at Interpol in Singapore recently suggesting only something like 3% of cybercrime cases that they bring to court actually result in a conviction, and that relates to real problems about digital evidence and the police gathering evidence that is sufficient to convict people of these offences. And of course we're all familiar with various legal scandals around cybercrime. Kim.com comes to mind. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Kim.com. Apparently he's living down in Queenstown now, building an underground bunker for all the Silicon Valley types come over at the end of the world. But without wishing to get too stuck into him, his extradition proceedings, he's wanted by the Department of Justice in America for money laundering, illegal distribution of copyrighted material, and the extradition procedure's been going on for 6 years or something like that. So if you want to, without commenting on the merits of the evidence against him or the politics around it, interesting that he formed a political party to try and influence the New Zealand political process. Regardless of what you think about Kim.com, this is illustrative of the legal and jurisdictional issues in dealing with someone who there's probably pretty significant evidence against in relation to cybercrime. If you want to prosecute people, to hold them to account, is it going to take 6 years to extradite every single person that's wanted for one of these offences? So dealing with cybercrime is still an incredibly complex issue. Some countries don't even have laws that make hacking an illegal offence. I was in Indonesia for an ASEAN-related event a year or two ago, and the Indonesian officials that were there were talking about the introduction of their cybersecurity law, which made hacking a criminal offence. So lots of countries either haven't harmonised their laws in this area or simply don't have laws that make hacking a criminal offence. So how can you deal with this kind of international problem in that sort of environment? So cybercrime, a big area of activity that we should be concerned about. And I think this is distinct in some ways from cyber espionage. And as we go up the triangle, we're beginning to get more into the political areas and the political strategic military areas. And I've already cited the statistics relating to the extent of data loss from the US Department of Defense. And espionage, again, is an increasingly common activity through cyberspace. Cyberspace has created an incredible platform for cyber espionage. You know, during the Cold War, how were people conducting espionage? They were doing it through listening posts and wiretapping and hacking into telephones. Now we have this incredibly large global platform for communications, which is remarkably easy to exfiltrate data and information from. Again, there are no laws against international espionage. Espionage is almost a common practice that states accept happens, right? So how do you hold people to account internationally for this area of activity? Again, the US approach has been to use the Department of Justice to indict people like Kim.com, or there was an example of the Russian hackers associated with the US election hack being indicted by the Department of Justice, the members of the Chinese People Liberation Army that were suspected of cyber espionage being again indicted by the US Department of Justice. But unless you get these people into the United States to face censure in the US court system, you can't really do anything about this area of activity. So again, highly problematic and highly damaging. Cyber terrorism, here is where we truly get to the fear and paranoia. I think this is one of the areas where there is the biggest conflation and where there is a degree of hyperbole that is unhelpful around acts of cyber terrorism. It's important to note that this sort of term cyber terrorism really emerged out of the post 9/11 environment in the United States. What happens after 9/11 is the US put in place lots more border security, aviation security, and the fear becomes that groups like Al-Qaeda will try and strike the United States remotely. If they can't travel as easily to the United States or get into the United States or use aeroplanes as missiles, then they're probably going to look to cyberspace to conduct damaging cyber attacks. So the very term cyber terrorism, I think, really stems from the fear and paranoia that lots of people probably legitimately felt after 9/11. But most scholars would say that we haven't yet witnessed a single act of cyber terrorism. Cyber terrorism doesn't really exist. It hasn't happened. Why do I say that, and why do other scholars say that? Well, it relates to the conventional characteristics of terrorism. What is terrorism? It's violent, it's targeted at civilians, it's political, and it's designed to cause fear. So violent, political, targeted at civilians, and meant to cause fear. Now, where does the cyber attack fall down on those four categories? Cyber attacks can be political, right? They can probably cause fear, target at civilians, yes, but are they ever violent? Not directly. So according to that kind of categorization, cyber terrorism doesn't exist. There are scholars that say the same thing about cyber warfare. Cyber warfare doesn't exist because cyber attacks are never in and of themselves violent, and warfare is characterized by it being violent. What I do think is probably accurate to say is that the internet, again, has provided a huge platform for terrorist groups to propagate their cause, to finance their activities, to radicalize people, to spread propaganda. We had a sickening period a few years back where there were ISIS beheadings being posted on YouTube. We're all familiar with these shocking pictures. That's not cyber terrorism. That's terrorist use of the internet. These actors haven't, fortunately, as yet acquired the sorts of capabilities where they could conduct a particularly violent, destructive cyber attack. Those capabilities really are the purview of states at the moment. That doesn't mean that we haven't seen action taken against terrorist groups for cyber attacks. The United States, again, famously conducted an airstrike against a jihadi hacker a few years ago. But again, by those sorts of definitions, cyber terrorism is actually a very small area of activity. But we hear that term thrown around a lot. And again, we've got to be a little bit wary about why. If we're fearful about cyber terrorism, maybe we're going to invest a lot of money in cyber security. So we need to be a bit skeptical and make that distinction between cyber terrorism and terrorist use of the internet. And the final category that I think we're seeing increasing growth in and states increasingly investing in is around cyber warfare. And I would define cyber warfare quite narrowly in respect of it being cyber attacks which are designed to amplify or multiply the impact of military operations during a conflict. So cyber attacks that amplify and multiply the effects of military operations, the use of conventional force within a conflict. But we hear cyber warfare thrown around in all sorts of ways. You know, the Russian subversion of the US election is often described as an act of cyber warfare, as constituting cyber warfare. Well, no, really, I think it's more appropriately characterized as cyber espionage. And that's not to say that militaries across the globe aren't taking cyber warfare seriously. We now have about 60 states globally that have developed cybersecurity units in their national militaries. About 30 of those are developing offensive cybersecurity capabilities. So the capability to hack into an adversary's computer systems, to deny them information, again, to increase, amplify the effects of a particular military operation. And again, we're seeing, I think, the Pandora's box open in this area of activity. Security dilemmas, new cyber arms races, lots of countries jumping on this military cyber bandwagon. And I'll talk about New Zealand's ventures into this area in a little second. So again, I think that what I'm trying to do here is provide a bit of clarity about the main areas of activity and to cut through some of the hyperbole and some of the conflation that we've seen in recent years. I want to also mention what I think are some of the latest and evolving challenges in the area of cybersecurity, because of course I think cyber and computer security is by its very definition a very fast moving, quickly evolving field, and it's often said that our laws and our policies and our strategies don't really keep up with this rapidly evolving technology. So a particular worrying area is the growth of dark markets, not just in things like drug trafficking or child pornography, but actually the selling of cybersecurity tools online. So we're seeing an increasing trade in things like banking trojans, which are designed to steal account login details. These can be purchased for as little as $500. DDoS for hire websites, so you can actually go and hire a hacking group to conduct a distributed denial of service attack for you. There was a notable police operation by the UK and Dutch authorities recently that went after one of these DDoS for hire websites. We're seeing a rapid expansion in what has become known as the Internet of Things. The number of internet-connected devices is set to go from about 8.4 billion in 2017 to about 20.4 billion in 2020. And of course, this creates new vulnerabilities. We all have phones and computers, but think about the number of other internet-connected devices that people are using now, how secure those devices. This is potentially a big area of concern. Still ongoing severe skill shortages in the sector, projected to perhaps be as much as 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs in coming years. And this is where universities like mine at Waikato come in. We're doing a lot to try and address this skills shortage, to try and develop the cybersecurity talent that can then go into the government or the private sector and protect our critical infrastructure. A big rise in social engineering. According to EY's Global Information Security Survey, about 74% of cyber attack sources are careless or uneducated employees doing silly things. This was the John Podesta example, vulnerable to an email phishing scam, which should be avoided for the most part. But there's increasing evidence that the hackers are becoming more sophisticated. They'll be looking at your social media profile. Oh, this Joe Burton fella, he's been to Auckland and stayed in the very nice Pullman hotel. Maybe we can send him an email that mentions that his payment at the Pullman hotel didn't go through. Please click on this link to get the refund. So again, increasing evidence that people are actually looking at your social media profile, finding out personal information about who you are as a person and what you've done, and then targeting the cyber intrusion based on that social engineering. So this is an increasingly sophisticated area that hackers are really adapting their tactics. Election vulnerability, we've talked about that already, and big concerns about cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. About $1.2 billion of cryptocurrencies was stolen, again via hacking, subversion of computer networks in 2017. I appreciate time's running on a bit, so I'm going to try and whip through the rest of the content. I always plan to talk for half an hour and then just end up getting carried away, and I don't want to keep you from the nice drinks and the Q&A particularly. What is our exposure and our response to this area of activity? Well, about 1 in 5 Kiwis are affected by cybercrime each year, estimated cost of $257 million in 2016. 200,000 New Zealand businesses targeted by cyber attacks in 2016, 19,000 average cost of those attacks to businesses, a 8% increase in cyber incidents recorded by the National Cybersecurity Centre between 2015 and 16. 50% of New Zealand businesses still don't have an incident response plan for a significant cyber attack, or have one but it's not yet operational. And about only half of board members request information about their company's cyber readiness. So clearly we need to think about the protocols and the organisation of corporate management with response to cyber risks and threats, and these figures are all from Microsoft surveys. What about how businesses feel about cyber intrusions in New Zealand? Again, lots of people think that their organisation has been affected by economic crime, including cybercrime, in the last few years. And when asked, thinking about the next 24 months, how likely or unlikely is it that your organisation will experience cybercrime? Again, in New Zealand, about 40% of businesses surveyed think that they are likely to be subjects to cybercrime. Again, pretty worrying statistics. We've heard a lot in the news about business confidence recently. Well, of course, the confidence levels of being immune to cyber attacks, I think, are going down. What about the number of incidents? Well, these are statistics from our New Zealand Computer Emergency Response Team. Again, we see the general trajectory is a growing number of serious incidents reported to the National CERT quarter by quarter. A lot of this growth is the fact that we're actually encouraging the business sector to report more activity when there has been a cyber breach. So the growth isn't necessarily the growth in the overall number of incidents, it's the growth in those that have been reported, which is a good thing, but still very much an upward trajectory. And in New Zealand, particularly, phishing and credential harvesting appears to be the major problem, stealing of passwords and so on and so forth, which is the graph at the top there. How well prepared are we? Well, actually, according to some surveys, we're one of the more cyber mature countries. So the survey on the left, this is from the International Telecommunications Union, top 10 countries that are the best and least prepared for cyber attacks. And yay, New Zealand and Australia have made it into the top 10 best prepared countries. The other map is a heat map. Again, the green indicates an increased level of cyber maturity. So comparatively, internationally, we're doing quite well in developing our national response to these issues, and we're putting in place capabilities to respond. That doesn't mean that we're not vulnerable. Yes, we have capabilities and organisations that can help and respond to cyber attacks, but we are a very networked society and there are still a lot of vulnerabilities there. And if you look back at what we've done in New Zealand over the last 5 or 10 years, we've actually, I think, made quite a lot of progress. We have a National Cyber Security Centre in the GCSB, a National Cyber Policy Unit in the Department for Prime Minister and Cabinet. Our intelligence agencies have been reformed to give them powers to intercept electronic communications when necessary. Of course, this was hugely controversial back in 2013, but enhanced powers to, again, mitigate cyber threats. The Cortex programme, which is a voluntary programme where the GCSB and the government will work with critical infrastructure, private security providers to help them with their cyber security, monitor their networks, provide them technological tools to enhance their cyber security. I think this is a good example of cooperation between the private sector and government. We've had the New Zealand CERT established, we've got a new defence force capability, public awareness campaigns, increased academic programmes such as the one at University of Waikato who are developing cyber skills, and a New Zealand cyber skills task force. So these are probably the most notable, again, institutional developments in terms of our ability to respond to cyber attacks. And I think, again, we've made quite a lot of progress in this area in recent years. What is the way ahead? What more do we need to do? Well, again, events like this, I think, are really important. We need to have dialogues. We need to have conversations about cybersecurity. We need to increase awareness. That's all a bit woolly, but it's important to have these sorts of events and conversations. What I'd like to see probably is more international engagement on these issues by the New Zealand government. And we are doing some things in that area, but I think our cyber diplomacy particularly could be enhanced. Ultimately, we're not going to deal with cybercrime in New Zealand. It's going to have to involve international collaboration, diplomacy, working with other countries, because most of the malicious activity that's directed towards New Zealand is emanating overseas. So if we don't look outwards, we're not going to be able to deal with our own cybersecurity issues and vulnerabilities. New Zealand could, for example, join the Budapest Convention. This is a Council of Europe treaty which encourages police cooperation and harmonisation of laws on cybersecurity. We are developing cyber diplomacy. We've had some engagement with the Pacific and ASEAN countries on these issues, but we could do more. Australia have recently created a position in their government which is the Australian Cyber Ambassador, a guy by the name of Tobias Feakin, who used to work in the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We could create a New Zealand Cyber Ambassador to, again, push these issues in international forum. CERT New Zealand has been just named as the inaugural chair of PACSON, which is the Pacific Cybersecurity Operational Network. So we're seeing our national CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, increasingly cooperating with other CERTs in the South Pacific and in the wider Asia Pacific region, and this is all very positive. What about a Cyber Geneva Convention? The Geneva Convention prohibits targeting civilians in warfare. Well, could we not have an agreement between countries that they rule out state-based attacks against cyber attacks against civilians, against health facilities, for example? This isn't my idea. This was what Brad Smith, the chief executive of Microsoft, proposed last year. So these sorts of thoughts are getting increased attention. What about an international attribution agency, an IAEA for cyber attacks? Take the attribution of cyber attacks away from the intelligence agencies, which aren't really trusted by a lot of people. Create an independent international body of judges from various countries who would be able to attribute cyber attacks, so we wouldn't have the smoke and mirrors around major cyber attacks anymore. This is something that should be considered. We've had a long history in disarmament and arms control in New Zealand, the anti-nuclear movement. Well, what about a cyber arms control treaty? Again, these are very problematic, difficult things to achieve because cyber attacks are cyber technologies are much less easy to identify than having a nuclear site somewhere. but I think this is an area where we could be doing more. Building resilience, being able to get internet services back up and running in the event of a cyber attack, making sure that our societal services are planning to ensure the continuity of those services in the event of a cyber attack is really important. Building norms and expectations of behaviour in this area. And I think we've also got to think more and more about the impact of evolving technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence in this area. Quantum computing is set to revolutionise encryption, basically creating incredibly powerful computers, which creating encryption which is basically impossible to break. What implications is that going to have for dealing with issues around terrorism or cybercrime? Artificial intelligence, again, has massive potential for both cyber defense, protecting your own networks, situational awareness, and also cyber offense. So what are going to be the implications of AI for cybersecurity? We've got a New Zealand national cybersecurity strategy. We don't as yet have a national strategy for AI. Maybe we need one. So these are just some of the areas, I think, some of the things we could be doing to throw some ideas out there. Just by way of finishing now and stopping talking, we do also have this enhanced cyber defence capability. This is taken from the New Zealand Defence Policy Statement of 2018, which suggests within our Defence Force we're moving more from a defensive cybersecurity position to an offensive one. So basically developing an offensive cyber capability in our defence forces. And this is something I'm concerned about. There are certainly valid arguments for having that capability. If we have troops deployed to Iraq, for example, they're being targeted by hackers, why wouldn't we want to take out those hackers with a cyber attack? But the growing militarisation of cybersecurity also has the potential, I think, to lead to arms races, instability, the escalation of conflict, collateral damage from cyber attacks. The infamous Stuxnet virus spread to about 150 countries, again causing ultimately billions of dollars of wider damages. So what are the implications of us moving in this direction? Should we be doing this? This is a values-based question. It's a norms-based question. Is this in our national interests ultimately? What are the benefits? What are the pros and cons? What are the rules of engagement around when our military should be using offensive cyber operations? A lot of these questions are still unanswered, and I think warrant further debate and further attention in the New Zealand context. I thank you. I know I've gone over time. I apologise for that. Like I say, I always get a bit carried away. Very happy to hear any comments and questions. And again, thank you very much for having me and for listening.
Thank you very much.
And please flick me an email if you'd like to continue the conversation by email. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Thanks.